at 9:23 a.m. Beijing Standard Time on a Tuesday morning this month, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi placed a telephone call to his counterpart in Tehran that would commit the People's Republic of China to the most ambitious intervention in Middle Eastern security affairs in the nation's modern history. Within 72 hours, that intervention would collapse in a sequence of events so devastating that it would fundamentally alter calculations in Washington, Tehran, Moscow, and every capital watching the struggle for control of the Strait of Hormuz. What happened next exposed the limits of Chinese power projection in a way that no amount of American diplomatic pressure or military demonstration could have achieved. And the consequences are still unfolding right now as leaders in Beijing scramble to contain the strategic damage. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, a geographic choke point through which approximately 20% of the world's entire seaborne oil supply passes every single day. For the People's Republic of China, this waterway is not merely strategically important, but existentially critical. China imports roughly 5 million barrels of crude oil daily, and approximately 8 million of those barrels transit through Hormuz every 24 hours. Without that flow, Chinese refineries begin running short within 11 days, industrial production starts declining within 3 weeks, and the entire economic growth model that sustains Communist Party legitimacy faces terminal stress within 6 weeks. This is the calculation that drove Wang Yi's phone call, the arithmetic that convinced Beijing it had no choice but to intervene when Iranian actions threatened to close the strait, and the same mathematics that would make China's subsequent failure so catastrophic for Xi Jinping's regional ambitions. The immediate crisis that prompted Chinese intervention began 8 days earlier, when the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy seized the commercial tanker Advantage Suite in international waters, declared a partial blockade of the strait, and announced that no vessel would pass without explicit Iranian authorization. Oil prices spiked $8 per barrel within hours. The United States Fifth Fleet moved 3 additional guided missile destroyers into position. Iran's supreme leader issued statements suggesting the blockade would remain until American sanctions were lifted and frozen Iranian assets were released. For China, watching from Beijing, the situation represented both catastrophic threat and strategic opportunity. The threat was obvious: economic strangulation if the crisis continued. The opportunity was more complex. If China could broker a resolution, it would demonstrate that Beijing, not Washington, held the keys to global energy security, validating the entire Belt and Road Initiative narrative and positioning China as the indispensable mediator in the world's most volatile region. The Chinese intervention strategy was developed over 48 hours of intensive internal deliberations involving the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Commerce, the People's Liberation Army Navy Command, and Xi Jinping's personal foreign policy advisors. The plan that emerged committed China to 3 simultaneous initiatives designed to give Iran a face-saving path to reopening the strait while establishing Chinese influence as the decisive factor in regional security. First, China would announce immediate purchase of an additional 500,000 barrels per day of Iranian crude oil at above-market rates, injecting approximately $40 million in daily revenue into Tehran's treasury, and demonstrating that China, not the United States, controlled Iran's economic lifeline. Second, Chinese state-owned shipping companies would commit to transporting Iranian oil regardless of American sanctions threats, breaking the isolation that had constrained Iranian exports for years. Third, and most ambitiously, China would deploy People's Liberation Army Navy vessels to the region under the public justification of protecting Chinese commercial interests, creating a military presence that would theoretically balance American naval power and give Iran confidence to back down without appearing to surrender to Washington's pressure. The announcement came at 2:47 p.m. Eastern Standard Time through a carefully coordinated series of statements from Beijing and Tehran. China's foreign ministry described the intervention as a responsible great power, ensuring freedom of navigation and energy security for all nations. Iranian state media framed the Chinese commitment as vindication of Tehran's resistance strategy and proof that American pressure had failed. Oil futures dropped $4 per barrel immediately on the assumption that Chinese mediation would resolve the crisis without military confrontation. Currency markets rallied. European leaders praised Chinese constructive engagement, In Beijing, the initial response among Xi Jinping's advisors was satisfaction that the intervention had achieved its first objective, demonstrating Chinese influence and marginalizing American positioning. Then the United States Navy moved and everything changed. At 4:15 a.m. local time, the guided missile destroyer USS Paul Hamilton intercepted the Chinese-flagged bulk carrier Haitong 88 as it approached the eastern entrance to the Strait of Hormuz. The Paul Hamilton is an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, over 500 feet long, displacing 9,200 tons, carrying a crew of 323, and armed with Tomahawk cruise missiles, SM-2 surface-to-air missiles, vertical launch systems capable of engaging targets at ranges exceeding 90 miles, torpedoes for anti-submarine warfare, and a 5-inch Mark 45 naval gun that fires 20 rounds per minute with a range of 13 nautical miles. The destroyer positioned itself directly in the shipping lane and transmitted a message to Haitong 88 that every vessel entering Hormuz would be subject to inspection for compliance with United Nations Security Council resolutions and international maritime law, and that any vessel refusing inspection would be denied passage regardless of flag state or stated cargo. The Chinese captain aboard Haitong 88 immediately contacted his company headquarters in Shanghai. The shipping company contacted the Ministry of Transport. The Ministry of Transport contacted the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs contacted the People's Liberation Army Navy. And within 90 minutes, Chinese leaders in Beijing faced a decision they had not anticipated when they designed their intervention strategy. Would China use military force to protect its vessels from American inspection? Or would it accept the American challenge and watch its entire Hormuz strategy collapse in public humiliation before it had even begun operating? Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications, because what happened in the next 6 hours exposed calculations about Chinese military capability and strategic will that American planners had been trying to assess for decades. And the implications of those 6 hours are reshaping great power competition across every dimension, from the South China Sea to the Taiwan Strait to contested waters around the globe. The People's Liberation Army Navy Command in Beijing issued instructions to Haitong 88 to comply with American inspection demands. Chinese state media, which had been celebrating the intervention just hours earlier, suddenly went silent on the Hormuz situation. The destroyer USS Paul Hamilton conducted a thorough inspection of Haitong 88's cargo and documentation, a process that lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes, during which every ship approaching the strait from either direction had to watch and wait and understand that the United States Navy, not Chinese diplomatic announcements or economic commitments, controlled actual passage through this waterway. When the inspection concluded and Haitong 88 was cleared to proceed, the precedent had been established. Chinese vessels would submit to American authority in these waters. But the strategic damage to China's intervention was only beginning. The inspection of Haitong 88 revealed something that Chinese planners had not adequately considered when they designed their 3-part strategy to save Iran and expand Chinese influence. The United States Navy does not merely control passage through the Strait of Hormuz through ships and weapons and positioning. It controls passage through an intelligence and surveillance network so comprehensive that no vessel moves through these waters without American awareness of its cargo, ownership structure, ultimate destination, financial backing, and connection to sanctioned entities. The inspection documentation provided to Haitong 88 included not just standard maritime safety verification, but specific details about the vessel's ownership through shell companies registered in Hong Kong and the Cayman Islands, its previous port calls over the preceding 6 months, its financial arrangements with Iranian state-owned enterprises, and the specific individuals within China's state-owned shipping conglomerate who had authorized the voyage. The message was unmistakable. American intelligence penetration of Chinese commercial operations was far deeper than Beijing had understood, and any attempt to use civilian shipping to circumvent sanctions would be exposed and interdicted regardless of Chinese government backing. Within hours of the Haitong 88 inspection, 5 additional Chinese-flagged vessels approaching Hormuz altered course and returned to their previous ports without attempting passage. 2 oil tankers that had been scheduled to load Iranian crude at Karg Island notified their charterers that the voyages were canceled due to technical difficulties. a bulk carrier carrying Chinese industrial equipment meant for Iranian infrastructure projects, turned around in the Gulf of Oman and headed back toward the Malacca Strait. The Chinese commitment to transport Iranian oil, regardless of American sanctions threats, had lasted less than 12 hours before Chinese shipping companies independently determined that the commercial and legal risks of defying United States naval power exceeded any benefit from government contracts or diplomatic considerations. The collapse of China's shipping commitment created an immediate crisis for the second pillar of the intervention strategy: the promise to purchase an additional 500,000 barrels per day of Iranian crude at above market rates. Oil that cannot be transported cannot be purchased, and China's state-owned oil companies now face the reality that moving Iranian crude from Persian Gulf terminals to Chinese refineries would require either accepting American inspections and sanctions enforcement at every step, or finding alternative transportation methods that did not exist at the required scale. Chinese importers immediately contacted Iranian counterparts to renegotiate the purchase agreements, requesting delays in delivery schedules while technical arrangements were finalized. Iranian officials understood precisely what those delays meant. The Chinese commitment was evaporating. Tehran's response revealed the third dimension of China's strategic miscalculation: the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which had seized the tanker that triggered the entire crisis, had agreed to China's mediation effort based on calculations about Chinese reliability as a counterweight to American pressure. When Chinese shipping companies began refusing Iranian routes and Chinese oil purchasers started requesting delays, the IRGC leadership concluded that Beijing had made promises it either could not or would not keep when confronted with actual American power. At 6:32 p.m. local time, IRGC Navy fast attack boats intercepted another commercial tanker in the strait, this one flagged in Panama, but carrying cargo ultimately bound for China. The seizure was a message to Beijing. Iran would not end its blockade based on Chinese assurances that had already proven worthless. The third pillar of China's strategy, the deployment of People's Liberation Army Navy vessels to the region, now faced a decision point that Chinese planners had hoped to avoid. With Iranian cooperation dissolving and the commercial shipping component of the intervention collapsing, the planned deployment would either have to confront American naval forces directly to restore Chinese credibility, or it would have to proceed with a mission that no longer had any practical purpose beyond demonstrating that Chinese warships could reach the Persian Gulf, a capability that had never been in doubt and that provided no actual strategic benefit. The deployment had been announced but not yet executed when the intervention began unraveling. 2 Type 052D guided missile destroyers and 1 Type 903A replenishment ship had been conducting anti-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden, approximately 1,800 nautical miles from the Strait of Hormuz. The original plan called for these vessels to proceed north through the Arabian Sea and position themselves at the eastern approaches to the strait, where their presence would theoretically provide reassurance to Chinese shipping and demonstrate Beijing's commitment to protecting its interests. But now Chinese planners faced the question: protection against what threat and through what mechanism? American forces had demonstrated they would inspect Chinese vessels regardless of planned presence. Iranian forces had demonstrated they would continue seizures regardless of Chinese diplomatic efforts. The deployment would not change either dynamic, and it might expose Chinese naval capabilities to American intelligence collection in ways that would undermine China's strategic position in far more important theaters like the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. The People's Liberation Army Navy vessels remained in the Gulf of Aden. Chinese state media, which had announced the planned deployment, quietly stopped mentioning it. The ships eventually rotated back to their home port in Zhanjiang without ever entering the Persian Gulf. The intervention strategy's third pillar had been abandoned without ever being tested, a silent admission that Chinese leaders had concluded that deploying naval forces would produce more costs than benefits. The entire intervention, from Wang Yi's phone call to the effective abandonment of all 3 strategic pillars, had lasted 9 days. During those 9 days, China had committed its credibility to solving the Hormuz crisis, had promised Iran economic support and security guarantees, had positioned itself as the alternative to American dominance in global energy security, and had then systematically failed to deliver on every commitment when confronted with the operational realities of American naval power and Iranian intransigence. The consequences of that failure extended far beyond the immediate embarrassment. The economic dimension alone was catastrophic for Chinese strategic planning. China had offered to purchase an additional 500,000 barrels per day of Iranian oil at above market rates, which at the committed price of $88 per barrel would have represented $44 million in daily payments, or approximately $1, $32 billion monthly. That commitment was now void, but it had been made publicly, which meant that Chinese credibility for future resource deals was damaged. More immediately, the failure to secure Iranian oil supplies meant that China's actual import needs had to be met through other sources at current market prices, which had risen $11 per barrel due to the Hormuz crisis. China's daily oil import bill had increased by approximately $115, $5 million simply due to the price spike, or roughly $3, $5 billion monthly. The intervention had been designed to secure Chinese energy access at favorable terms and demonstrate Chinese influence. Instead, it had made Chinese oil imports more expensive while demonstrating Chinese impotence. The Belt and Road Initiative implications were even more severe. China's entire strategy for expanding influence in the Middle East, Central Asia, and beyond depends on the narrative that Chinese economic partnership and infrastructure investment provide an alternative to Western-dominated international systems. When nations consider whether to align with Beijing's vision or maintain traditional relationships with Washington and European capitals, the fundamental question is whether China can actually deliver the security, market access, and reliable partnership it promises. The Hormuz intervention had been designed to answer that question definitively by showing that China could solve regional crises and protect partner nations from American pressure. The answer that actually emerged from those 9 days was exactly the opposite. When confronted with determined American power, Chinese commitments evaporated. Chinese shipping companies prioritized their own risk management over government policy, and Chinese military forces chose not to even attempt to challenge American control. For nations watching from across the developing world, the lesson was unmistakable. China could offer financing for ports and railways and infrastructure projects. It could purchase commodities and provide diplomatic support in international forums. But when actual security challenges emerged that might require confronting American power, China would make promises it could not keep, abandon partners when the costs got serious, and retreat from commitments when tested. This lesson had immediate implications in every region where China sought influence. Saudi Arabia had been negotiating expanded energy cooperation with China under arrangements that would reduce Riyadh's security dependence on Washington. Those negotiations slowed noticeably after Hormuz, with Saudi officials telling American counterparts that Chinese reliability had not been demonstrated and that the kingdom would maintain its primary security relationship with the United States regardless of commercial ties with Beijing. The United Arab Emirates, which hosts extensive Chinese investment and had been expanding security cooperation with Beijing, clarified publicly that American defense commitments remained the foundation of Emirati security planning. Pakistani officials privately told American diplomats that while Chinese infrastructure investment was valuable, Islamabad had observed China's Hormuz performance and retained no illusions about Chinese willingness to support Pakistan in any serious confrontation with India. Indonesian leaders, who had been considering Chinese proposals for expanded South China Sea cooperation, concluded that Chinese naval power could not actually challenge American control in contested waters, and that Jakarta's interests required maintaining balanced relationships rather than aligning with Beijing against Washington. The pattern repeated across regions and nations. The Hormuz intervention had been designed to demonstrate Chinese capabilities and credibility, but its collapse had revealed Chinese limitations in ways that no American government, white paper, or think tank analysis could have achieved. Beijing had defeated its own influence campaign through the most credible possible method, by attempting to exercise influence and failing publicly. Here is what makes this particularly devastating for Xi Jinping's strategic positioning. The Chinese intervention was not a minor diplomatic initiative that could be quietly abandoned and forgotten. It had been announced through the foreign ministry, celebrated in state media, described as evidence of China's responsible great power role, and positioned as the solution to a crisis that threatened global energy security. The subsequent failure could not be hidden or spun or reframed because it had occurred in full public view with clear metrics of success and failure. Chinese ships had been inspected or had turned back. Chinese oil purchases had not materialized. Chinese naval deployments had been canceled. Iranian cooperation had collapsed. Every element of the strategy had failed in ways that were observable to every government and analyst watching the situation. This is where Chinese decision-making regarding Iran becomes particularly important to understand. The relationship between Beijing and Tehran has been developing for decades, built on Chinese need for energy resources and Iranian need for economic and diplomatic support against American pressure. China is Iran's largest trading partner, purchasing roughly 90% of Iranian oil exports despite sanctions. Iran relies on Chinese investment in its energy infrastructure, Chinese provision of dual-use technologies, and Chinese diplomatic cover in international institutions. The relationship is substantial and consequential for both parties. But the relationship has always operated under a fundamental constraint that the Hormuz intervention exposed. China needs Iranian oil, but China needs global market access and American acquiescence to its economic model even more. When forced to choose between supporting Iran and maintaining the commercial relationships and maritime access that sustain Chinese economic growth, Beijing will choose its own interests every single time. Iranian leaders understood this intellectually before Hormuz, but the intervention forced them to understand it operationally and strategically. The four men who actually run Iran, the officials who make decisions about the Revolutionary Guard, nuclear policy, regional operations, and resistance strategy, had watched China promise support and then retreat within days when American power was applied. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, who is 85 years old and has been watching great powers make and break commitments to Iran for decades, had authorized cooperation with the Chinese intervention based on calculations about what Beijing would actually deliver. When the promises collapsed, his assessment of Chinese reliability adjusted accordingly. President Masoud Pezeshkian, who had advocated for expanded Chinese partnership as an alternative to negotiating with Washington, saw his argument undermined by Chinese behavior. IRGC Commander Hossein Salami, who controls the military forces that had seized the tanker and declared the blockade, concluded that Chinese support was rhetorical rather than operational. Defense Minister Aziz Nasserzadeh observed that the People's Liberation Army Navy had chosen not to even attempt to demonstrate its capabilities when tested. These conclusions matter because they shape Iranian decision-making about future crises, nuclear negotiations, regional operations, and alignment strategies. If Iranian leaders believe Chinese backing is reliable, they calculate that they can resist American pressure and escalate confrontations with confidence that Beijing will provide economic and potentially military support. If they conclude Chinese support evaporates when seriously tested, they understand they face American power essentially alone, which changes calculations about acceptable risk, escalation thresholds, and negotiating positions. The Hormuz intervention taught Iranian leaders the second lesson, and that teaching is changing Iranian behavior right now in ways that American diplomats and military planners are only beginning to understand. Iran's willingness to actually close the Strait of Hormuz has declined sharply since the Chinese intervention collapsed, not because Tehran has decided to accommodate American interests, but because Iranian leaders now understand they cannot count on Chinese support for actions that might trigger serious American responses. Make sure you are subscribed right now and have notifications turned on, because the next phase of this situation is developing at this moment. And what happens in the coming weeks will determine whether China's Hormuz failure represents a temporary setback or a fundamental shift in how nations across the Middle East, Asia, and beyond assess Chinese power and American dominance. Russia's response to China's Hormuz failure provides another critical dimension of the strategic consequences. Moscow watched Beijing's intervention with particular interest because Russian and Chinese interests in the Middle East are simultaneously aligned and competitive. Both nations seek to reduce American influence in the region, expand their own economic and military presence, and secure access to energy resources and strategic positions. But they compete for the same partner relationships, the same commercial contracts, and the same diplomatic influence. When China committed to purchasing an additional 500,000 barrels per day of Iranian crude at above market rates, Russian officials immediately calculated the implications for Russian energy exports. Iran and Russia compete directly for market share in Chinese crude oil imports, and any expansion of Iranian sales to China comes at Russian expense. The Chinese commitment to Iran, if actually implemented, would have cost Russian energy companies approximately $1. $5 billion in monthly revenue that would have gone to Iranian competitors instead. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov issued public statements supporting Chinese mediation, while Russian state-owned oil companies quietly approached Chinese importers, offering additional crude volumes at competitive prices. When the Chinese intervention collapsed and the promised Iranian purchases evaporated, Russian energy companies moved aggressively to expand their sales to fill the gap. China still needed to import 5 million barrels daily, and if Iranian supplies could not reliably reach Chinese refineries due to American interdiction and Chinese shipping company reluctance, those barrels had to come from somewhere. Russian crude exports to China increased by approximately 380,000 barrels per day in the 2 weeks following the Hormuz intervention collapse, representing roughly $33.4 million in additional daily revenue for Russian companies, or just over $1 billion monthly. Russia had gained market share at Iranian expense because China's attempt to help Iran had failed. This dynamic reveals a structural tension in the relationship between Beijing, Moscow, and Tehran that constrains their ability to actually coordinate as an anti-American coalition, despite rhetoric about multipolarity and resistance to Western hegemony. When Chinese intervention helps Iran, Russia loses energy revenue. When Russia expands sales to China, Iranian export opportunities contract. When either China or Russia actually confronts American power directly, the costs and risks fall on whoever takes action while the benefits are shared. This creates powerful incentives for performative solidarity without substantive cooperation, and the Hormuz situation demonstrated exactly that pattern. The United States had been attempting to fracture the China-Russia-Iran alignment for years through diplomatic outreach, sanctions pressure, and military positioning. American success had been limited because the three nations shared genuine interest in resisting American dominance and found value in their partnership despite internal tensions. But the Hormuz intervention accomplished what American policy had failed to achieve. It revealed that when tested by actual American power, Chinese support for Iran was unreliable, Russian support was cynically self-interested, and both Beijing and Moscow would prioritize their own economic and security interests over partnership solidarity. Iran was learning the same lesson about its major power partners that smaller nations had learned about Chinese Belt and Road promises. When costs get serious, support becomes rhetorical rather than operational. The consequences for American strategy in the Middle East and globally are profound. For decades, American planners have worried about the challenge of simultaneously containing or competing with China, Russia, and Iran across multiple theaters and domains. The nightmare scenario involved coordinated Chinese, Russian, and Iranian action that would force Washington to spread military and economic resources across too many challenges simultaneously. The Hormuz intervention demonstrated that such coordination, at least under current conditions, is far more difficult for Beijing, Moscow, and Tehran than American planners had feared.